My name is There it is. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dakota Hufford, and I'm the Communications and Program Coordinator for Clackamas River Basin Council. And I'm joined by Eric Butler, our riparian restoration specialist. And I wanted to just say thank you so much for joining us today. This is our final of 7 webinars in our webinar series designed to help you be a better steward of your land here in the Clackamas Basin. And before we get started, I just wanted to share our land recognition with you. So many of us are joining from Oregon and Washington, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we are gathered on the unceded land of many Native peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the many communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and in the future. All right, just a quick schedule. We'll do a very brief CRBC intro, then we'll talk about wildfire in our region. We'll talk about what fire needs to thrive, and then some Firewise landscaping techniques, and then we will end with a question and answer session. So our goals for today are, we hope that you gain a new understanding of fire ecology or review your knowledge of fire ecology. We hope that you can take away at least one new Firewise landscaping technique to either use at your house and property or share with somebody that you know. And we really do want, and also a list of resources. And we really do want to hear from you, but in an effort to conserve time, as we only have about 30 minutes here together, we ask that you just hold your questions to the end of the presentation or pop them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. And additionally, please remember we are recording, and to just go ahead and keep your mic on mute unless you want your comments to live forever on our YouTube channel. All right, so just real quick, the Clackamas River Basin, our mission here is to foster partnerships for clean water, to improve fish and wildlife habitat, and enhance the quality of life for those who live, work, and recreate within the Clackamas River Basin. We are a 501c3 nonprofit watershed council, and for the past 20 years, we've been invested in restoring and protecting the Clackamas River and its tributaries. We do this through in-stream and riparian restoration projects. The photo on the left shows CRBC contractors installing large wood in a stream for fish habitat. CRBC hosts volunteer events and educational workshops such as this, all free to the public. The image in the middle shows our down the river cleanup, where volunteers help us clean up a 22-mile stretch of the Clackamas River to protect water quality. We also offer streamside residents with free weed removal and native tree and shrub planting through our Shade Our Streams program. And we help residents with wildfire recovery. The image on the right is a freshly planted baby tree after the 2020 wildfires. All of our work is aimed at improving the Clackamas River and its tributaries, but we really cannot do this work without folks like you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric.
Hello, everyone. I want to start to talk a little bit about what wildfire is and how it exists in our region. It's a natural process. It's something that's occurred frequently in our region for thousands of years with many, many different causes. And not all parts of our regional landscape are equally fire prone. There's a very complicated and interesting history of fire ecology in our region. And a big part of that, of course, is also cultural fire. And cultural fire practices have historically maintained many of our most important ecosystems. Along the bottom, this slide, you can see a whole succession process where you have a wildfire that really sort of resets the landscape by clearing out the vegetation. It gradually turns first into a sort of a meadow grassland landscape. Gradually, trees and shrubs move in. You get kind of a savanna that develops into a closed woodland, and finally into a forest. And fire is a really important part of maintaining these open prairie habitats and a lot of the forest structure and native habitats that we know about. That said, we live in very different times, and have to wonder what changed. Well, one of the issues is that our land management has changed a lot. We have practiced fire suppression and a lot of forestry practices over the last 150 years that have really disrupted these natural and cultural fire cycles. And as a result, there's a lot more fuel in the landscape. There's a lot more material that can burn. We also live in an era of climate change. We have hotter and drier summers, which makes the fuel a lot more combustible, pulls a lot of the moisture out of the grass and wood and other material. And finally, have a lot more risk exposure because of development in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. This is essentially the area where our housing and our developments are intermixed with natural landscapes or forests and grasslands and such. And so there's a lot more interface between flammable natural environments and the built environment. And because of this mix of increased hazard and increased exposure, there's more risk of wildfire in having negative impacts on our lives and livelihoods. So when we're thinking about fire safety in Alaska, we really want to think about what's called the fire triangle. These are the three things that fire needs to exist and to flourish. First is heat, or the second is fuel, and the third is oxygen. Heat really, for considerations of wildfire risk management, it's really about ignition sources. 85% of modern wildfires are started by humans, and this is from many different causes, things like recreation, anything from people who leave their campfires burning after they leave, or things like fireworks, target shooting, vehicles and equipment could be another big source of wildfire ignition. So even something like dragging trailer chains or a faulty exhaust system or something that can create a fire. Debris burning. So you really want to pay attention to when burn bans are in effect whenever you're doing pile burning, even during the winter months when it would supposedly be safe. And then finally, there are many cases of intentional starts. For instance, there was a very, very vast landscape scale wildfire in 1902, the Columbia and Euclid fires. This was started by two teenagers who were trying to set a hornet's nest on fire. And interestingly enough, this happened in almost the exact same location as the 2018 Eagle Creek fire, the group of teenagers who started that with firecrackers. Another thing that fire needs is fuel. And there are a lot of different kinds of fuel on the landscape. A lot of the fine, low density fuels, especially, are the things that catch very easily. And so these are things like mulch or wood mulch, dry grass, brush, small trees, anything that's got a lot of surface area. And hot, dry weather, like I said, makes these fuels more flammable because it pulls a lot of the moisture that would otherwise be in these out. And so in the hot months of August, September into October, this is when these fuels are especially dry, especially easy to catch. And then having spatial continuity of these fuels, whether it's ladder fuels like brush and small trees that are growing in forest understories, or annual grasses that are sort of filling the spaces between, or sort of native bunch grass prairies where there's a lot more interruption. This makes fire spread a lot more readily because there aren't these breaks that are kind of slowing the movement of fire, either vertically or horizontally. That said, there are also a lot of natural fuel breaks in the landscape, especially our well-watered riparian areas, or beaver wetlands, especially where it's really retaining a lot of moisture in the vegetation, a lot of water on the ground, creating these wide expanses of wet area that really interrupts fire movement. There's increasing talk about, we should, instead of talking about Smokey the bear, we should be talking about Smokey the beaver. And finally, fire needs oxygen. Oxygen, of course, is everywhere, but its availability to fire really varies based on the topography and the prevailing winds. So where you have areas of steep slopes, these create updrafts. This is more dangerous because this causes air to move more quickly. It tends to move up the hill, and so that's pushing fire along. And so that creates an increase and creates increasingly dangerous fire behavior. Then where you have steep, narrow valleys and ravines, these can create chimneys where there's a higher concentration of oxygen moving through the system. These are most dangerous because these can really drive fire a lot. And so with these things in mind, this really kind of gives some insight into how to break the fire triangle in order to reduce wildfire risk. So for heat and ignition, it's really a good idea to practice good fire safety all year, prevent ignitions, put your campfires out, make sure that your vehicles and power equipment are well maintained, don't operate things in flammable areas during fire-prone conditions, pay attention to burn bans, pay attention to the industrial fire protection level. Really, if it's not a good time to burn or do anything that could cause a risk of fire, save this for a better time. And with fuel, it's really good to implement Firewise landscaping, which we'll be talking about next. And finally, with oxygen, think about how the terrain shapes the risk and kind of move your activities and your landscape features away from the areas where there's higher hazard. And so going into Firewise landscaping, the first step is to manage fuels. And this happens at kind of all different levels. So on the ground, you really want to avoid woody mulch over large areas. Now, woody mulch is incredibly useful stuff, especially for having healthy plant establishment. I really like to do mulch rings or donuts around new trees that I'm establishing because that really helps retain soil moisture and keep the temperature lower, so it really boosts survival. But at the same time, you don't need to spread the stuff over big areas. So think about, again, if you're using mulch or something like that, kind of think about maintaining breaks between where you're using things and just kind of use it strategically. With grass, mowing, keeping it short, keeping a lot of tall grass from growing up, especially maintaining fire breaks, and then using irrigation to keep grass green and less flammable during the hot, dry months. With woody vegetation, really again, kind of breaking this fuel density and fuel continuity, so using thinning, spacing when you're establishing trees and shrubs, taking out ladder fuels, and removing or downsizing dead or dying trees. It's fine to have some wildlife snakes around, but this might be a case where you take off a lot of the finer limbs and just kind of leave the big trunk in place. And irrigation, where appropriate, is something that, again, can really reduce the flammability of the plant materials you already have on the landscape. Another really important component is maintaining defensible space. Defensible space is essentially a series of buffers where you're kind of increasing the management of fuel continuity. So within about 3 to 5 feet of your house or what other structures you care about, you really want to keep this area as clear as possible of any sort of flammable material or grass or mulch, other things that are even slightly flammable. Within about 5 to 10 feet, you want to maintain more of a gap for trees and shrubs, and also removing any sort of overhanging branches that could carry fuel up or could carry fire up onto a rooftop or the top of the structure. Want to keep about a 30-foot perimeter, ideally clear of any sort of dead or dying vegetation, pine needles, coarser brush, anything that's a particularly particularly highly flammable. And then within a 100-foot perimeter, this is where you want to kind of manage the larger fuel continuity, do thinning and tree spacing and things like that. This does not mean have no trees in your landscape or any sort of vegetation. Trees are really important. It just means proper tree placement, proper tree care. And all of this is kind of assuming that you have large amounts of land. Defensible space is obviously a lot harder to do in urban areas, but really the principles here can be applied at different sorts of scales. And so even if you don't have a lot of space to work with, you can still implement things on smaller scales that will still be very helpful. And so you can kind of downsize these to fit smaller yards as well, and it'll still make a difference. Fire-resistant structures are also really valuable. So choosing safer materials like composite shingles rather than cedar shake or other materials like that. Aluminum or fiberglass or other sorts of synthetic siding are a lot less flammable than wood siding. Use of brick, hardscaping, gravel mulch, other kind of non-flammable surfaces. non-wooden fences, again, irrigating your lawn, and lawn sprinklers can also be used to kind of increase the performance of a fire break. And then maintenance is also an important part. So you want to keep your roof and gutters clean and just kind of check for any sort of damage. You kind of do good exterior maintenance on your house. And there are trade-offs with all these kind of fire-resistant techniques with ecologically friendly landscaping. Then again, it's really about kind of finding your balance, finding your comfort level, and finding ways to incorporate the kinds of values that you want without increasing fire hazard beyond your comfort level. Plant selection is another really important thing. So low-risk plants have high water content, relatively low height, low growth habit. Broad leaves are safer, open growth structure rather than having a lot of dense interior structure. Thick, non-peeling bark, and something that doesn't produce a lot of oily or volatile substances or waxes or other things that can be particularly flammable. And there are a couple of good Firewise plant lists that are available. I can drop these into the chat right now. It's also important to think about the lay of the land. Think about where water sources are. These water sources, things like hose bibs, irrigation systems, and also natural water features like streams, springs, wetlands. These are kind of your more naturally resistant sites to the spread of fire, and they can also be your resources for helping with firefighting. Think about slopes and ravines, again, oxygen being one of the key drivers of fire behavior. So thinking about how the topography influences the risk on your landscape. What existing fire breaks you have, so hard surfaces like driveways, patios, are there natural fuel breaks? And also think about where you're storing flammable materials, so firewood, fuel tanks, anything like that. You want to keep these away from other structures that you care about. And of course, that fire doesn't respect property boundaries. It really takes a community level effort and working at the landscape scale to really make a difference for fire resistance. And so cooperation is crucial. This is where you want to work with your neighbors, with agencies, community organizations, contractors, and others to help scale up wildfire readiness. Talk to your neighbors, talk to organizations in your community, figure out what's going on around you to really add to the work that you're doing on your own property and just kind of make fire safety something that happens throughout your area. There's some good news too that the Oregon State Fire Marshal is offering free defensible space assessments. So if you go to OregonDefensibleSpace.org, you can schedule a defensible space assessment for your property. It doesn't cost any money. This is all funded by the state legislature. And there are a lot of other good resources out there. There's a great OSU extension publication, Keep Your Home and Property Safe from Wildfire. This covers a lot of what we talked about today in even greater detail, and also has a lot of Oregon-specific advice, including state and local regulations. Firewise USA is another great resource from the National Fire Protection Agency. Again, it provides a lot more detail on defensible space and other Firewise practices. For taking it up to the next level for community-based response, the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network with FATNet is a really great resource. And finally, for any sort of emergency preparedness, whether it's wildfires or anything else, ready.gov has a lot of excellent resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. Eric, you mentioned Smokey the Beaver, and I just wanted to talk about Smokey the Beaver really, really quick. So yes, as Eric mentioned, maybe we should be calling it Smokey the Beaver instead of Smokey the Bear. And so I just wanted to share some of this new information with you out of new research that's coming out. So beaver dams and beaver mimicry, so like when beaver dam analogs, when humans recreate beaver dams, are gaining popularity as a low-cost, nature-based strategy to build climate resiliency at the landscape scale. Beavers slow and store water in their ponds, canals, and the surrounding soil during wet periods, which can then be accessed by riparian vegetation during drought times. And as a result, the well-watered vegetation in beaver-dammed riparian corridors is less flammable. New research has shown that these beaver-influenced patches of the landscape stay green and can serve as fire refugia, preserving intact, mature riparian habitat even during mega fire events. So perhaps instead of relying solely on human engineering and management to create and maintain fire-resistant waterways and riparian zones, we could benefit from partnering with beavers ecosystem engineering to achieve the same goals at a lower cost. And I have this really cute 45-second stop motion video of beaver that I'm just gonna pop into the chat. It's just a little claymation video on how they keep the land wet. All right, so our watershed, like so many others, is rapidly changing due largely to human-caused changes and development, with many streams and natural areas being heavily impacted by those changes. By stewarding your own space and helping spread the word to others about Firewise landscaping, you can help mitigate some of these environmental changes on a community level. Here's a short recap and just some final thoughts on ways you can be a steward to your land in regards to fire ecology. And as always, please reach out to us with any questions. So we want to just remember that wildfire is a natural part of the landscape and that fire readiness happens year round. It's not seasonal. You want to do an assessment and make a plan. And just keep in mind the fire triangle, the heat, fuel, and oxygen, and how to break it. One last final call to action. If you are a Clackamas Basin resident, please also consider taking our pesticide pledge. You will receive an awesome yard sign, and it will show your friends and neighbors your commitment to keeping our water clean. I will pop the link in the chat now. And with that, we are at Q&A time.